когда им воспринимается молодые, маленькие, детишки, о них забота у нашего правительства большая, вы сами знаете. Растут, выживают.
With absolute power, ideological fervor, and unimaginable brutality, emerged from humble and violent beginnings in the small Georgian town of Gori to become the unchallenged dictator of the Soviet Union for a quarter of a century. A ruler whose policies and paranoia fundamentally shaped the destiny of the 20th century, and whose legacy continues to cast a long shadow over the nations of the former USSR and the global communist movement. Born on December 18, 1878, his early life was marked by poverty and violence. His father, Bessarion, was an alcoholic who beat his wife and son mercilessly, while his mother, Ketevan, a devout and hard-working washerwoman, fiercely loved her son and dreamed of him becoming an Orthodox priest. A path that initially seemed plausible given young Joesp's sharp intellect, which earned him a scholarship to the Theological Seminary in Tbilisi, an institution that would ironically become the crucible for his radicalization rather than his devotion. The strict, oppressive atmosphere of the seminary, with its constant surveillance and stifling religious dogma, bred in the young Jigashvili not piety but a deep-seated resentment for authority and a fervent interest in the revolutionary ideas that were circulating clandestinely throughout the Russian Empire at the fin de siècle. He began reading forbidden literature, including the works of Marx and Lenin, and was soon expelled from the seminary in 1899 for his subversive activities, marking his formal entry into the world of revolutionary politics and setting him on a path from which there would be no return. Adopting the pseudonym Koba, after a legendary Georgian folk hero and outlaw, he plunged into the underground world of the Russian Social Democratic Labour Party, specializing in the gritty, dangerous work of revolutionary organizing, raising funds through bank robberies and extortion, printing illicit pamphlets, and agitating among oil workers in Baku, all activities that led to multiple arrests, exiles to Siberia, and daring escapes, a cycle that hardened him and earned him a reputation within the Bolshevik faction as a man of action, a doer rather than a talker, a crucial asset for Vladimir Lenin, who valued such ruthless pragmatism.
Теперь, когда от Китая и Кореи, Чехословакии, Венгрии появились новые ударные бригады в лице народно-демократических стран, теперь нашей партии легче стало бороться. Да, и работа пошла веселее.
It was during this tumultuous period that he first began using the name Stalin, which means man of steel, a moniker that perfectly encapsulated the persona he was crafting for himself: unyielding, formidable, and coldly efficient, a persona that would soon be tested by the seismic events of the First World War and the Russian Revolution of 1917, which saw the collapse of the Tsarist regime and the eventual seizure of power by the Bolsheviks in October of that year, an insurrection in which Stalin played a significant, though not central, role, primarily as an editor of Pravda and a loyal executor of Lenin's directives, a position that earned him a place in the new government as the People's Commissar for Nationalities, tasked with managing the complex ethnic tapestry of the former empire. The ensuing bloody civil war between the Reds Bolsheviks and the Whites, a loose coalition of anti-Bolshevik forces from 1918 to 1921, provided Stalin with another platform to demonstrate his ruthlessness and organizational capacity, often through brutal means. As a political commissar on various fronts, he clashed fiercely with the brilliant but arrogant Red Army commander Leon Trotsky, a rivalry that would later define the power struggle after Lenin's death, and his actions during the defense of Tsaritsyn, later Stalingrad, now Volgograd, where he implemented a reign of terror against perceived enemies and military incompetence, prefigured the methods he would later employ on a national scale. Lenin's death in 1924 created a vast power vacuum at the top of the Soviet state, and Stalin, who had been appointed General Secretary of the Communist Party in 1922, a role initially seen as bureaucratic and administrative but which he astutely used to place loyalists in key positions throughout the party apparatus, was perfectly positioned to outmaneuver his far more intellectually prestigious rivals, most notably Trotsky, whom he systematically isolated, ridiculed, and eventually exiled from the Soviet Union before having him assassinated in Mexico in 1940. Stalin's rise to absolute power was a masterclass in political cunning. He initially presented himself as a moderate, a humble disciple of Lenin's truest pupil, and formed tactical alliances with other party leaders like Grigory Zinoviev and Lev Kamenev to destroy Trotsky, only to then turn on his former allies and accuse them of deviationism, all while slowly promoting his own doctrine of socialism in one country, which argued that the USSR could and should build socialism on its own without waiting for world revolution. A populist and nationalist idea that resonated deeply with a party and a population weary of war and internationalist idealism. By the end of the 1920s, all opposition within the party had been silenced or expelled, and Stalin stood alone at the apex of Soviet power, ready to embark on a radical transformation of the Soviet economy and society through a series of 5-year plans and the forced, violent collectivization of agriculture, policies that would have catastrophic human costs but would, in his view, propel the USSR into the ranks of modern industrial powers capable of defending itself against a hostile capitalist world. The collectivization campaign, which involved the seizure of land and livestock from millions of often wealthier peasants or kulaks and the herding of them into collective farms, was met with widespread resistance, which Stalin crushed with utter ruthlessness. Peasants who resisted were shot, deported to Siberian labor camps, the nascent Gulag system, or left to starve, with the latter outcome becoming horrifyingly reality during the man-made famine in Ukraine known as the Holodomor from 1932 to 1933, where Soviet policies of requisitioning grain despite a poor harvest led to the deaths by starvation of millions, a tragedy many historians consider an act of genocide aimed at destroying Ukrainian national identity. Simultaneously, the breakneck industrialization drive prioritized heavy industry, steel, coal, machinery, armaments, over consumer goods, creating massive new industrial cities like Magnitogorsk, and transforming the economic landscape but at a staggering human cost, with workers living in squalor, facing intense pressure to meet impossible production quotas, and subjected to draconian labor laws, all justified by the constant propaganda portraying this immense suffering as a heroic, patriotic struggle for the future. The 1930s, however, would be defined not by economic policy but by terror, specifically the Great Purge or the Great Terror of 1936 to 1938, a period of intense political repression, paranoia, and show trials that saw Stalin systematically eliminate any potential source of opposition, real or imagined, from within the Communist Party, the military, the intelligentsia, and the general population. The purge was triggered by the assassination of his close ally Sergei Kirov in 1934, an event many believe Stalin himself orchestrated to provide a pretext for the crackdown, and it was executed with fanatical zeal by the NKVD, the secret police under the command of the sinister Nikolai Yezhov, and later Lavrenti Beria-old Bolsheviks like Zinoviev, Kamenev, and Nikolai Bukharin were arrested, subjected to grotesque show trials where they confessed to outrageous and fabricated crimes of treason and espionage, and were promptly executed, while across the country, a wave of arbitrary arrests, torture, and executions swept up millions of ordinary citizens, factory managers, engineers, soldiers, teachers, peasants, who were denounced by neighbors, colleagues, or even family members, creating an atmosphere of pervasive fear and suspicion where no one was safe. The Red Army was particularly decapitated, with roughly half of its officer corps, including most of its top generals, being executed on spurious charges, a self-inflicted wound that would severely hamper Soviet military effectiveness in the early stages of the coming war with Nazi Germany. Stalin's paranoia during this period was pathological. He personally signed execution lists containing tens of thousands of names, and he seemed to believe in a vast, interconnected conspiracy against him, a belief that was both a cause and a product of the isolating nature of absolute power. This paranoia would also shape his disastrous foreign policy in the late 1930s. Deeply suspicious of the Western democracies Britain and France, and convinced they wanted to turn Hitler's Germany eastward against the USSR, he shocked the world by signing the Molotov-Ribbentrop Non-Aggression Pact with Nazi Germany in August 1939, a cynical agreement that included a secret protocol to divide Eastern Europe into spheres of influence, giving Stalin a free hand to invade and annex the eastern half of Poland, the Baltic states Estonia, Latvia, Lithuania, and parts of Romania. This pact provided the USSR with crucial strategic depth and bought time for rearmament, but it was a catastrophic miscalculation of Hitler's intentions. Despite numerous intelligence warnings from his own spies and from Western governments, Stalin refused to believe that the Führer would break the pact and attack, viewing the warnings as British misinformation designed to provoke a conflict. Consequently, when Operation Barbarossa was launched on June 22, 1941, with over 3 million German troops pouring across the border, the Soviet Union was caught utterly unprepared. The Red Army, still reeling from the purges, suffered staggering losses, with entire armies encircled and captured, and Soviet air forces were largely destroyed on the ground on the first day. Stalin was initially paralyzed by the shock of the betrayal, retreating to his dacha for several days in a state of nervous collapse, but upon returning to Moscow, he took firm control, appointing himself Supreme Commander-in-Chief and rallying the nation in a famous radio address, not in the name of communism, but in the name of the Great Patriotic War for the survival of the motherland, a brilliant rhetorical shift that tapped into deep Russian nationalist and patriotic sentiments. The war years saw Stalin's leadership at its most brutal and its most effective. He micromanaged the military effort, often with stubborn and costly errors. But he also proved capable of learning, eventually delegating authority to talented generals like Zhukov and Vasilevsky, and he excelled at the grand strategic mobilization of the entire Soviet economy and society for total war, with factories relocated east of the Urals and churning out tanks and planes at an incredible rate. The human cost was astronomical, with Soviet casualties dwarfing those of any other nation, due in part to his ruthless tactics like Order 227, detachments to shoot retreating soldiers, and his willingness to sacrifice millions of his own people to achieve victory. The pivotal battles of Stalingrad and Kursk broke the back of the German Wehrmacht, and the Soviet Red Army's relentless westward advance all the way to Berlin in 1945 cemented the USSR's status as a global superpower and Stalin's own image, both at home and abroad, as the indispensable architect of victory over fascism. The post-war period, however, saw a rapid return to repression and the intensification of the cult of personality that had been building since the 1930s. The Soviet Union, though victorious, was a shattered nation, with over 27 million dead, countless cities in ruins, and a population yearning for some measure of relaxation after the unimaginable hardships of war. Instead of reform, Stalin offered only renewed terror and ideological orthodoxy. The Iron Curtain descended across Eastern Europe, as the Soviet-occupied nations were transformed into satellite states under communist puppet regimes, forming a buffer zone that Stalin deemed essential for Soviet security, an action that directly triggered the Cold War with the West. Domestically, any hope for a more open society was crushed. Returning prisoners of war were often treated as traitors and sent directly to the Gulag, and a new wave of purges, though less frenzied than the 1930s, targeted cultural figures. Scientists, particularly in the devastating Doctors, plot an anti-Semitic campaign alleging a conspiracy by Jewish physicians to murder Soviet leaders, and even party officials in the Leningrad affair. The cult of Stalin reached its apogee. His portrait was everywhere. His writings were treated as sacred scripture, and he was credited with almost divine wisdom and superhuman capabilities in every field, from linguistics to biology to military science, while the history of the revolution and the war was ruthlessly rewritten to magnify his role and erase his defeated rivals, most notably the crucial contributions of Marshal Zhukov, who was sidelined. His personal life in these final years was a study in Gothic isolation and paranoia. He lived in a heavily guarded dacha outside Moscow, surrounded by sycophants and terrified subordinates whom he would humiliate at late-night drinking sessions that served as a form of psychological torture and political testing. He trusted no one, not even his own doctors, and his relationships with his children were strained and often cruel. The physical and mental toll of a lifetime of immense stress, suspicion, and absolute power was evident. He suffered from atherosclerosis and likely a series of minor strokes that made him increasingly erratic and irascible. His final act, the concoction of the Doctor's plot in early 1953, seemed to presage a new, vast purge on March 5, 1953, leaving behind a nation frozen in fear, an empire stretched across Eurasia, and a legacy of death and suffering on a scale that is almost incomprehensible, with estimates of those who perished as a direct result of his policies through execution, famine, and the horrors of the Gulag numbering in the tens of millions. Joseph Stalin was, ultimately, a revolutionary who became a tyrant, a man who believed the construction of a utopian future justified any present atrocity, and in doing so, he created a system that was a monument not to socialism or human progress, but to the limitless potential for human cruelty when absolute power is concentrated in the hands of one